welcome to the Salty Frog. So we're going to explore salt tolerance and sea level rise, as well as citizen science today. Okay, let's see if I can click. There we go. So for our outline for this presentation, we are going to talk about the basics. So our amphibian basics, we're going to dive right into those, and then our amphibian habitat preferences. We're going to look into some threats. One of those is, of course, sea level rise. So then we're going to look at the implications of sea level rise on frogs and toads. Then we're going to look at the saline tolerance of our frogs and toads. So we're going to dive in. And then we are going to end on a positive note, and that is the ways that we personally can take action to help frogs and toads. Here we go. It doesn't like my arrow all of a sudden, so sorry for the dings. Okay, let's start with the poll. I want you guys to tell me, who do we include in amphibians? You probably already have some hints. So what animals do we include in our group of amphibians? Do we have any in the chat box? Oh, you're muted.
Toads and frogs and salamanders, frogs and toads, toads, frogs, newts, and salamanders. We've got some great answers going on.
Good. Awesome. You guys really...
Sicilians.
Yay! There it is. We got them all. I was waiting for that. Okay. So, wonderful audience. You know your amphibians. So our frogs and toads are closely related, and they are grouped together and considered Anurans. Our Urodels are those newts and salamanders that you can see in the bottom left of your screen. And then Gymnophiona includes all of our Sicilians. And all of our amphibians have some things in common, of course. They are vertebrates, which means they have a backbone. They are ectothermic. We also call that cold-blooded, but it just means that they are warming themselves with their outside environment, as opposed to us, who we have are endothermic and are warming our bodies ourselves with our internal systems. They all lay soft and jelly-like eggs, and they require water to do that. They all have a larval stage in which they'll have gills and that they're living in water. And they all develop lungs to eventually breathe air, with the exception of one species of lungless Sicilian. So again, Sicilians are those slimy, weird, kind of alien-looking critter down at your bottom right. Amphibians are really important for our ecosystems. They are indicator species, which means that they are sensitive enough to be able to warn us when something is off in their environment. So if there is a negative environmental change occurring, our amphibians are usually some of the first that we start to see decline in that ecosystem or environment. So another phrase that we use to say indicator species is the canary in a coal mine, which you might be familiar with. They're sensitive in part of their permeable skin. So they have very porous and breathable skin. Think of it like a sponge. So whatever they are in, the water or habitat that they are in, or is touching their skin, can very easily end up in their bloodstream. So they can breathe through their skin. They're also indicator species because they don't have high mobility. They can't readily move out of an ecosystem or a particular habitat if there are those negative impacts occurring. You can see it looking like itty bitty legs, like such tiny little legs, no legs. Very hard for them to move. So in comparison, a bird would be more easily able to switch its habitat, like move to a different habitat, if there were some negative impacts happening to the one it was residing in. Okey-dokey. All right. So distribution. So all of our Anurans, and I'm going to generally say Anuran to include frogs and toads versus constantly saying frogs and toads. You are looking at a species richness map. So this map is helping us to be able to see where there's the greatest amount of biodiversity, where there are the most different types of species of Anurans, frogs and toads, regionally across the world. So you can see by the key, yellow is fewer species, and our bright red is the most different types of species. So frogs and toads really prefer tropical and neotropical regions. That's where there's the most species richness. Around the world, you can see that there are over 5,000 species of frogs and toads. I read multiple different things, 5,200, 5,400, 5,100. So for this presentation, I'm just going to say over 5,000. You can get on your own personal debate about exactly how many species there are. In North America, we have about 300 species. And you can see that in Virginia, or in the Southeast, we are lucky enough to have some of the greatest species richness throughout North America. Virginia is home to about 28 species, native frogs and toads. All right, raise your hand. I kind of how are currently in school and recently have studied the frog and toad life cycle. Do we have any folks? Yeah, raised hand. Awesome.
Yeah, you can raise hand with the reactions down.
Absolutely.
Like clap or give us a thumbs up.
So for some of us that are maybe a little bit older, we might have to go back a handful of years or decades to remember when we learned about the life cycle. Does anyone want to type in that box what a complex life cycle like the frog or toad has? What is that fun word called? I can see someone like fervently typing. I'm pretty excited about that.
Well, I've got some folks who said they raised tadpoles, which is pretty cool.
Oh yeah, that is really fun.
So what's their life cycle called? You can definitely put that in the chat.
Absolutely.
A couple of people mentioned that they start with eggs, which is cool.
Yeah, so we have that.
And I see metamorphosis has come up.
Ding, ding, ding. Metamorphosis. So that's a complex life history, that metamorphosis. And it does start with eggs. So an adult is going to lay eggs. I'm going to apologize because I can hear some ruckus, but I think it's passing down my driveway. So hopefully that doesn't disturb anyone. Then the embryo stage. So they lay the eggs, and you can see the little embryo in the egg. They'll eventually hatch out. There'll be a little hatchling and be a tadpole. And then the first part of metamorphosis is when they start to develop their hind legs. So you can see in that picture, they have hind legs. Then they'll develop their forelimbs. Usually when they develop their forelimbs is when, for scientific study, is when they say metamorphosis has occurred. So once both sets of limbs are visible. And at that point, we have one of my favorite words is froglet. Like, who doesn't like that word? You're a little froglet, and you start to absorb, or toadlet, and you start to absorb your tail, and you're going to lose the gills that you were using underwater, and you're going to develop your lungs, and then you're going to make your way out of the water. So this is important because when you have complex life stages, there are many factors that can kind of mess up your life stage. So we are going to talk a lot about the different life stages as this presentation goes on. Okay, so they need to spawn in water. So spawning is what we call the laying of those eggs in water. Amplexus, Amplexus, is what we call when the male and female come together for the male to externally fertilize those eggs, and then they go together to leave them in one of these spawning habitats. So lots of habitats listed there, all considered wetlands. And one of the things I just want to point out, like vernal pools are seasonal wetlands. So they are not permanent bodies of water. I guess one of my questions, just to see, can anyone think of why it is beneficial for a frog or toad or even salamander, newt, to lay eggs in a seasonal body of water? Can you think what is less threatening?
That's a good question. Like, why do you want to do it in seasonals? Because somebody asked about, can they spawn in puddles? Because they've seen that before. So a puddle would be an example of what you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm starting to get some answers. Some really good answers. One, easier for them to crawl out. Nothing else that will eat them. So no fish, no bigger frogs, fewer predators, fewer fish. A lot of like less predation is
absolutely. Absolutely, that is the number one benefit to these vernal pools. But like, I'm so glad someone brought up puddles, because I took a course in herpetology when I was living in North Carolina, and one of the things that we found were that there were some toads that would very commonly lay their eggs in like the tire ruts, like, so the water that would fill up from these tire ruts from people off-roading. But the danger is, if you have exceptionally hot or dry days, that it evaporates quickly, then you're out of water. So it's kind of like there's a gain and a potential risk for all of those scenarios. So very good. Connor got up and left. Not meaning to call Connor out, but I did notice that he has a really awesome bird poster in the background. So cool, Connor. Okay. So I guess we're going to talk about threats, but did we have any other questions before we really kind of dive into some of the threats about just basic amphibian, frog, toad, biology, life history sort of thing?
Not at the moment. Just a lot of really good answers to your questions right now.
Awesome. All right. So threats. Oh, could there be more things on this list? It kind of like hurts my heart a little bit. So this is the point where I'm going to ask you to bear with me, because I feel like it just gets kind of depressing, and I don't want it to be. But amphibians are facing a lot of threats. You can see in red that about 70% of our world's amphibians are in a state of decline. So that means their populations are trending downward. And then in the US, we are losing about 3.7% of our amphibians per year. So it's a small number, but it's actually a pretty high rate when you think about the reason frogs and toads and other amphibians lay so many eggs is because they are preyed upon. It's so hard to reach adulthood. So for something that's so yummy and snackable for so many other creatures, these threats are a big stressor on their populations. So one, habitat loss and fragmentation. So just clearing out habitat as well as fragmenting habitat. So one of the most common throughout the US is roads. Roads create fragments. So that is going to affect our amphibian friends. Pollution, and that includes fertilizers, whether it's natural or chemical, pesticides. So I say pesticides is like the broad, like any aside, herbicide, fungicide, insecticide, all those things can end up in our waterways. Or if you're spraying your yard and your toad friend lives there and you're spraying for mosquitoes, that is a toxin that can get in its skin. Introduced or invasive species. So this includes the animals that are not native, that have been brought in, usually accidentally, to a habitat and either take up resources. So maybe they are monopolizing and they're better at reaching the resources that a native species needs, and therefore the native species suffers, or it's an invasive that preys on the native, and maybe that wasn't a threat that they were used to before. So a common one is snakes introduced to islands where there weren't previously snakes. A lot of animals suffered that. They just didn't know what a snake was, and then all of a sudden they're getting eaten left and right. And one of the greatest, I mean, humans are really good invasive species. We have populated everything, but domestic cats have actually eaten and pushed many species over to extinction because they are such good predators, and we have brought them with us everywhere. So those guys, parasites and disease, one of the greatest threats that has been a global impact on amphibians, and in particular frogs and toads, is, I always want to make sure I say it right, it's the chytrid fungus, but formerly chytridiomycosis, and it is very viral and it spreads very, very easily. It originated in Central America and then has spread worldwide. And then this big guy, climate change, which gets a slide all of its own. Whew, my goodness, the list goes on. So for climate change, we know that is this big thing that is kind of like stalking over all of us. And it comes with so many effects or consequences. So I have this visual to hopefully help us break down climate change on a potential amphibian. So in this case, there's this inland toad, and this figure is from a study that was published in the Journal of Aquatic Conservation and Marine and Freshwater Ecosystems. So it was a computer-generated model of, in the events of sea level rise and climate change, we could experience these current conditions with these future conditions. So in the current conditions, you can see where the sea level rise is low, sea level is lower. You see the arrows up top that say solar radiation. So we have tree cover that's helping block solar radiation and keeping the understory cooler. We see that many of our toads and even frogs do have like little burrows or ways to escape the heat. And then our pond or pool, which is our breeding site, is fairly full of water. Now, with climate change, many things can potentially occur and don't always have to be occurring simultaneously or all across the world. Average temperature increases, shifts in humidity and evaporation rates, so especially thinking of those higher evaporation rates. Our lower picture is considering that we have that habitat fragmentation, so we're not considering some of the things that we're doing with our land use, which is exposing more heat and UV radiation to our understory. Not necessarily portrayed in this figure is the consideration of droughts in some areas of the world. Shifting home ranges, so as we have those temperatures rising, home ranges of not just amphibians, but all sorts of species are going to shift as well. We already in Virginia occasionally get alligators that like move up into the Great Dismal Swamp when it's like really, really warm, because the Great Dismal Swamp borders North Carolina, Southern Point. But let's just say at some point alligators move on up. Baby alligators love to eat frogs and tadpoles, so just one consideration. Our parasites and other diseases are potentially going to shift ranges too. And same thing with other introduced species. They just might thrive better. So those are big question marks. We look back down at this bottom graph and our sea level rise again. Sea level is closer, moved further inland. And so maybe this inland toad prior to sea level rise or climate change was maybe safe from storm surges or coastal flooding. But now with sea level rise or more intense storms, it is then experiencing this flooding, which salinity with that permeable skin can be lethal. Do we have any questions before we move on?
There are a ton of questions.
Okay, so good.
I'm going to just pick a few.
Okay.
Somebody asked when you were first talking about threats, were there any that were more significant than others in your opinion? Are there worse than others, or?
Oh gosh. You know, by far, the chytrid fungus it's one of those things that amphibians were already struggling with the pressures. And it is one of those things that it was introduced and, I mean, decimated populations. Some species even went extinct. So by far, getting that under control, because of course, you know, people, you know, you pick up a frog, you step in an area where the chytrid fungus is, and you spread it, people can affect that, definitely. So I want to say that, and not to take too much time, but I like to focus on the things that I also know I have control over. So I know I have control over the things that I put on my lawn, and our lawn industry, why can't I think of the word, like horticulture, that industry produces a lot of CO2. It puts a lot of fertilizer and other things onto our properties, and it's actually our home, like our personal lawn care outweighs the pollutants that causes, outweighs the agricultural industry in the whole scheme of things. So if I were going to give you something that you have control over, it would be analyzing what you're putting on your lawn.
Cool. That's good and good information. So, gosh, so many questions. Somebody asked about, could you see that, since you mentioned it again, the chytrid fungus, you know, can you see it if you see a frog?
You cannot see it. You would need to look under a microscope to see it. It gets in its skin, and it actually, you know, that permeable skin, one of the things it does is it actually like kind of clogs it up. So it has to be seen under a microscope.
And one more for now, because I've got them all, guys, so keep asking. Someone asked about that they had found 5-legged salamanders. A couple of people were mentioning mutations in frogs that they'd seen or heard about, and somebody said that they'd even seen 5-legged salamanders.
Oh.
And if you had anything,
I think we need to find a true herpetologist for that. My scientific gut instinct is that mutations do occur. And I've definitely done research where the embryonic stage for amphibians is very sensitive, so different pollutants can create deformities. But, and I can't tell you the specific species that have been studied, but salamanders have been known and are studied for regeneration of limbs. So I know that scientists are looking into how we can apply their ability to regenerate limbs to our health. So it very well could be a limb regeneration gone wrong. So I don't know the exact answer, but those are some routes that you can take in your further research to finding the answer.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to let you keep going and collect questions again.
Awesome. So sea level rise is where we're headed for the rest of this. Considerations of sea level rise. Just to put into perspective or have a number out there, it is estimated that sea level rise in the next century could be 1 to 2 meters. So there are different projections, but pretty steadily across experts in the sciences and climatology, we're looking at 1 to 2 meters. So implications. Of course, we just remember we got to focus on that super permeable skin, what's making them an indicator species. Amphibians are also poor osmoregulators, so they are just not evolutionarily designed for ion and salt transfer in the body well too. Those are just not chemical reactions that they are good at doing. You know, there are a handful of species that are amazing and evolutionarily adapted to going from seawater into fresh water for spawning. So we think of salmon, we think of American eels, bull sharks for hunting. There are species that are adapted for doing exactly that. These guys are not. Again, just the reminder of limited mobility. Can they get away from inundated areas? And that's not likely. And then there's the varying sensitivity within their life cycles. So we already got to mention from one of the questions that the embryonic stage is pretty sensitive. Larvae tend to be more tolerant to salinity than embryos do, because although they're poor osmoregulators, tadpoles can do some osmoregulation through their gills. Adults tend to be more tolerant of salinity than larvae because they're semi-aquatic, right? They can get out and at least leave the water in most cases, as well as they are able to produce some urea that's going to help with that water transfer, water and ion transfer. All right. Oh, good old Darwin. So Darwin has written about our amphibian friends, and he said these animals and their spawn are immediately killed, with the exception, as far as known, of one Indian species by water. And to remind us, so when we're thinking about climate change, and in this case sea level rise, we also have to appreciate nature's ability to adapt. And it's the thought of, okay, most animals, like, this is what we're made for. We're made to adapt, but it's how quickly can that be, can that happen in all the pressures that we're experiencing. So let's just remember that Darwin first noted natural selection, and that natural selection can interchangeably be called adaptive selection or adaptive evolution. And this is when heritable or genetic traits can be passed down to future offspring, and then those offspring have an increased rate of survival and then also increased fitness for more offspring of their own. Natural selection or adaptive evolution has been well documented as a phenomenon, an adaptation that can rescue populations from environmental stressors. So that's just something to think of and remember as we go through this presentation. All right, how many species of frog or toad do you think can survive in seawater?
That's perfect, because we've had a couple people ask that in the chat. So, so you're telling everybody that they have to tell you.
I want to know what you think. I mean, Darwin says he thinks one. So I don't know who wants to argue with Darwin or what.
All right, guys, put your, I've got one person says 1, 0, 2. Got some answers coming in.
Cool.
0, 2. I feel like going higher. No, 5? 0.5. That was a fun. So 100, 6.
Okay. Cool.
So a variety of answers. 6 came up a couple times. So nice guesses, everybody. 20, 1, a lot of ones.
All right.
All right, what's the answer? Big
Let's
reveal.
see. Here we go. That one Indian species. Okay. So in terms of true seawater, so let's think, parts per thousand is what we measure saline concentrations in. So that means one salt molecule for all the other 1,000 molecules that we're measuring. The crab-eating frog is that one Indian species found in South Asia, including Malaysia, and then parts of India. It doesn't live throughout all of India. But it is observed in environmental salinity of 35 parts per thousand. Seawater is considered 33 to 8 parts per thousand. So we have this one species that can be submerged in it. Here is the kicker. That's its adult stage. They still have to find fresh water in order to spawn. All right? So they still would have potential mortality rates if their embryos were laid in seawater. Other fun things about this frog, it's very, very widely studied. I mean, people are fascinated by our one true sea frog. But I do want to note, so if you aren't aware, IUCN stands for the International Union of Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. When we say IUCN, they're taking worldwide populations. So you're going to see this a couple of other places. That does not take in consideration regional populations. So for example, we're going to talk about some species in Virginia a little later. They will have their own population status from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as their own population status per state. So each of those entities will be analyzing their populations at these different regional levels. And lucky for this guy, their populations are increasing. I guess sea level rise and storm surges are doing it okay. They do tend to, so speaking of spawning, they tend to spawn after heavy rains. So there'll be a big heavy rain, which is going to negatively impact the amount of the salt concentration in water. So there'll be a lower salt concentration before they spawn. Most amphibians do a lot of their movement and spawning in big rain events. So you've probably, I mean, just raise your hand or give a thumbs up if on a super rainy spring or summer day you have about cried because you don't know how to avoid hitting some of the frogs and toads that are crossing the road. Like, I definitely, like, I'm so scared and sad. That's because it's like the perfect time for them to be spawning.
Real quick before we move on, I had a folks who wanted to know, is that truly the only frog that can survive in salinity, and do they eat crabs?
They do eat crabs, and we are going to learn a little bit more about salinity and other species. But so far, they're the ones that can, in the wild, and I think I glazed over. I said environmental salinity, so that is observed in nature, as opposed to experimental salinity, which of course some species have been studied in labs that they have altered the salinity in submersion. So the crab-eating frog has been seen and observed many times in that salinity. And I think the main thing here is it's not a one-off, because there have been, it's in my literature cited, that I can point out the study, it's Hopkins and Brody, 2015, that they did a comprehensive analysis of observations. So there are some one-offs that have been observed, but that is the true sea water okay species.
Great.
Cool. Making sure how I am on time. So, got to make sure, such good questions. But wait, there's more. This is the European green toad, and it is found in France to Western Russia. And then again, we see environmental salinity of 20 parts per thousand. That's not seawater. That is brackish water. However, brackish water is a really, really, really huge range. So water can be considered brackish if it's as low as 0.5 parts per thousand. And then that range goes up to about 30 parts per thousand. So brackish, high range, but this European green toad has been observed, populations of it, like not just one-offs, a single one observed once and never again, tolerating that brackish water. You can see that this is one species that is declining. Okay, making sure I'm on the right track. Next, so the next one, again, not a one-off, but consistently observed in brackish water, so 17 parts per thousand for this one, is the natterjack toad, which, oh my gosh, isn't that just like the best name ever? Natterjack.
Never.
So this is another one that's found in brackish water pretty consistently. One study from the Imperial College of London has found the natterjack's ability to be in these saline environments could prove beneficial against the spread of the chytrid fungus. So the chytrid fungus is not immortal. It's not impenetrable. It apparently does not like very saline environments and then certain levels of acidity. And so some research is being done to see, okay, what saline concentrations could be utilized to help with the management of this pathogen and help amphibians. So in this particular study of the natterjack toad, it was found to aid in slowing the spread or transmission of the fungus, as well as helping treat and protect these species. So that is pretty cool. It's one study. A lot more needs to be done. However, it is kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a hopeful thing to get to hear. All right. So everyone else, try to do this really quickly. So this this image is all amphibians. And it is telling us that there are definitely, this is from the Hopkins and Brody 2015 study, the comprehensive, like here are the amphibians that have been observed in saline environments. The thing I mostly want to note, because you're going to have access to this presentation at a later date if you want to study it more, is that the white bars are coastal species, and the amphibians that are absolutely going to be subject to sea level rise or storm surges. The black bar is inland species, and you're kind of like, well, what? Where's the salt coming from in inland species? They're inland, aren't they safe? Those observations come from road ice runoff into freshwater bodies. So commonly affected by those that are the wood frog and then spring peepers. Those are two species of frog. They're really closely related. They are here in Virginia, and they can be active, even ectothermic, even though they're ectothermic, in temperatures as low as in the 40s. And that's because they have some pretty cool chemical properties that act like antifreeze in their bloodstream. So that's a whole other presentation, because whatever, super cool. But that's inland. We're thinking road ice mainly, and then the hatched is a species that's found both inland and coastal. So 2% of our frogs and toads, that's 140-ish species, are observed in saline habitats. Now, I just think this is cool. I'm a numbers person. 18%, so in the 40s, of those 140 species are all tree frogs. So tree frogs are really well adapted for these saline habitats.
Interesting.
Cool. What's up? I wasn't sure. Is there a question?
No, it's really interesting.
Cool. Awesome. Okay. Whew. So much. All right. Now we are going to move on to really focusing on, well, we're not quite at our green tree frog yet. So our tree frog is going to be our main focus. But this next slide is to just put into perspective why so few amphibians are tolerating these saline habitats. So LC stands for lethal concentration. And then the number, so in this case 50, means the lethal concentration of salt is going to produce a mortality rate of 50%. So say 100 embryos are introduced to 4.5 parts per thousand saline concentration, 50% or 50 of those embryos will survive. So that's pretty low. I mean, when we think of storm surges, we can imagine that our saline concentrations will be higher than that. So the lethal concentration that produces 50% mortality in larvae is 5.5 parts per thousand, and then for adults, it's 9 parts per thousand. So these numbers were computed from a meta-analysis of many studies that were in laboratory experiments. So they took a huge compilation of laboratory experiments across many species to come up with these numbers. Do we have any questions about those?
Nope, you're good. Keep going.
Okay, cool. All right. So, adaptable life stages. One thing we know about, and we talked about with those ruts or those puddles, they've adapted to the potential for their water source to run out. Many frogs and toads will metamorphose sooner under high stress conditions, and those include quickly drying water bodies, exposure to pollutants, and then, of course, as we're talking, exposure to salt water. Of course, there are risks. Usually when the high stress situation is presented and they metamorphose sooner, they end up being smaller in size. They reach sexual maturity at a later date. So, for example, if sexual maturity is normally reached at 2 years, it may take 3 to 4 for that animal to reach sexual maturity. There have been recorded that offspring, they have fewer offspring when they do start reproducing, and then being smaller, they're less able to escape predators. However, they survived to the next life stage, and they are producing offspring, which if you were dead, you could not do. So, pretty well, doing pretty good. All right, quick poll, if we think we have time, you can tell me not, just a couple if you want. How many of the 28 frogs and toads found in Virginia are found in our coastal regions?
We'll take a few.
Yeah, just give me the first ones you get.
20,
Okay.
24, 12, 28, 15, 12.
Okay.
12. Okay.
Well, here we go. It's about 26. So I think it depends on, in my judgment, I tried to choose, when I was looking at the home ranges, the areas that were most prone to coastal flooding during our heavy rainy seasons. So I chose those. And it's about 26. And then 4 species are native, that are native to Virginia, have been documented in brackish water. So if you go down, so 1 through 4 is left to right on your bottom screen. We have our American toad, so Lithobates catsbianus is our American toad. Lithobates phennocephalus is our southern leopard frog. Did I say American toad? I meant bullfrog. I was just talking fast. It's an American bullfrog. Number 3, so our third picture is Gastrophren carolinensis, and that's the eastern narrowmouth toad. And then Hyla cincerea, which we're going to talk about much further, is the green tree frog. I have all of their IUCN population statuses. If you really want to know that, we can talk about those at the end. What's significant about these observations is that there are species that live in the same ranges as these that are found in brackish water, that are commonly being found in brackish water, that are very, very similar, very closely related. So, for example, Hyla cincerea is closely related to Cope's gray tree frog, as well as the squirrel tree frog. But those 2 species are not found in brackish water. There haven't been observations so far to the date of those. And then Lithobates are like true frogs. So related to the leopard frog and the bullfrog that live in similar regions are the green frog and the pickerel frog. And neither of those 2 have been observed in brackish water. So I just think those are, for future study, really interesting in how genetics or local adaptations have shifted. All right, so Hyla cincerea has the highest salt tolerance of any North American species. It gets the gold medal. It has been observed in the Chesapeake Bay in salinities between 15 and 23 parts per trillion. But in comparison to those species we looked at earlier, these are more of one-offs. You know, we have inland species that would not do that. So there are more of these than others, so I shouldn't necessarily call it a one-off, but it's not like entire populations that are staying in these really, really high concentrations. The studies that we're about to go over are concerning the green tree frog, and they were done in North Carolina through Eastern Carolina University, and they focused on 3 sites in North Carolina for their sampling and observations: Cape Hatteras National Seashore, New Inlet near Rodanthe, and Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. All right, so this is just, I like this table. Again, you can dig in and look at it more closely when it's posted, just time, because it's a lot to read. This is from Eastern Carolina University. The eggs were collected in both coastal and then inland locations. So they actually waited for pairs to be in amplexus, and then they took the pairs and had them lay the eggs in either these freshwater or saltwater concentrations. So I think there were 16 pairs total. So 8 from inland, 8 from coastal, and then each set were broken up to experience freshwater, saltwater in their embryonic state. They were measured after they hatched as little hatchlings. So it takes about 2 days for them to hatch, to like absorb their yolk, and then actually be like true hatch and start hatching from there. Again, is when those front limbs are showing. And some of the key things here is that you can scan these numbers and observe that the tadpoles in freshwater environments took a longer time to metamorphosize and were larger than their saltwater counterparts. So just in general, they were larger and they took longer to metamorphosize. You may also notice that the coastal frogs fared better than the inland frogs when introduced to varying levels of salinity. So across the board, our coastal frogs kind of like stayed the same in size, whereas our freshwater frogs, when exposed, they got smaller in size. And they also experienced, the freshwater guys overall experienced greater mortality. So locally adapted. We like to say local adaptation occurs when populations, so not, an entire, like the whole species population, but when populations have higher fitness in their local environment conditions compared to populations from other environments. These guys, these frogs spent less time in their larval stage, regardless of saline concentrations, even in freshwater. So those coastal populations, they didn't get bigger all of a sudden because they were treated in the freshwater condition. They have locally adapted to just have shorter time to metamorphosis and be smaller in size. Another sign of adaptations is that, so again, the mass stayed the same across salinities. And the mass of our inland frogs decreased as the salinity increased. So those are just some signs of what it means to be locally adapted. You know what? We have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to keep rolling so that we can definitely have time at the very end. Okay, so other considerations for, saline tolerance and survival and what it means for size. So remember, there were risks to being smaller, but it's good to survive. So the same folks that did the previous study that we were looking at also did a study on reproductive behavior or site selection, and then they call this maternal effect. So choosing where you are going to lay your eggs. Both their inland and coastal pairs, so they collected both the pairs, avoided increasingly saline waters. And then your inland frogs did not deposit eggs in salinities above 12 parts per thousand, whereas our coastal frogs laid about 24% of their eggs in the highest of salinities. So although they preferred lower saline concentrations, they also didn't readily avoid the highest salinities. Truly, for this figure, you can see that it's fuzzy, so that's representing their 95% confidence interval. So where it's kind of shaded across, that's just getting your 95% confidence interval. All right, so what have we learned? We know that our coastal regions will experience greatest negative impacts of sea level rise and saline inundation due to storm surge. It's even thought our western or Asian areas, so our Asian coastal borders, are probably going to experience them greater than us. And we also know that very few species, so remember 2% of all our Anurans have been found or observed in these brackish conditions. So we aren't sure how all those other species are going to fare. If we're going to have population die-offs, are they going to find a way to be rescued through natural selection and adaptive evolution? We're not sure. We need more studies. They haven't found that Hyla cincerea, or green tree frog, those local adaptations that we're seeing have not been found to say that it's a separate genetic or alleles that they're looking for to say oh wow, we absolutely have natural selection in action. So that's something to still be studied and considered. And then with so many stressors, we know that it's unclear how they're going to respond. All our amphibians are going to respond to this one particular stressor. And that's overwhelming. So that's why I am wrapping up this talk about sea level rise and saline tolerance with our PhDs and our scientists are few, but we are many. So there's power in all of us. So just really, really quick, how many of you would like to make the world a better place for frogs and toads?
I'm sure we're getting a lot of good answers.
Yes.
I did have a question.
Yeah.
Because I know it was in your title, because your title mentions Frog Watch. And
Yeah.
someone in the chat a while ago had mentioned that they knew that there were toad watches in places and wanted to know if there was anything similar near us that you could get.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Haha. So glad. Look at that. So these are some things that scientists need our help with. So they are, again, a few. They need help documenting changes in population size, identifying shifts in home ranges, invasive species movements, and if you're seeing or hearing a frog or toad in a saline environment. And how can we help them do that? By crowdsourcing data as a Frog Watch USA volunteer. So Frog Watch is a citizen science program that was developed by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And it launched in 1998. At the close of 2019, there were 151 chapters across 41 states. Over 10,000 recorded monitoring sessions. So the actual time that you spend out listening and recording, the intensities, how many frogs or toads you're hearing, those sessions, over 10,000 of those, and 85 species have been identified. And so that's just really exciting. Just for fun, I put the top 5 recorded species include spring peeper, green frog, gray tree frog, American bullfrog, and the American toad. So to answer your question, all it takes is learning your regional frog and toad calls and going through some Frog Watch training. So I'm a part, or the coordinator for the Maymont chapter of Frog Watch. Annually, we tend to do 2 training sessions. COVID, but there are online resources that if you email us, you want to take a screenshot of this right now, write it down, we can help guide you to the online resources for the general training. But to be a part of our Maymont chapter, we would then need to test you, which we could do virtually, on your local frog and toad calls. So good data means you need to learn those calls. So we have to quiz you to make sure that you're not making stuff up. You can follow us on Instagram. And then if you're not local, if you're not in the greater Richmond area, then you can find a local chapter near you. And if you are so motivated and there isn't a local chapter near you, you can start your own chapter and you can email me to help guide you to how to do that. But before we run off, not everyone wants to go and become a citizen scientist. It is time consuming. You do have to take time out of your day between February and August, or out of your evening, to go and monitor. And so that does take time, and not everyone wants to do it. I hope you do. But there are more ways that you can help. So reducing home fertilizers, pesticides, we talked about that. Supporting your public lands. So whether that's through donation or user fees, that is going to help protect habitat. Let wildlife be wild. It is illegal to take wildlife out of the wild and bring it into your home, or to transport wildlife. This is because it disturbs populations, and we just need all the amphibians out there as possible in their native home range, doing what they do best, and that's making more little toads and frogs. You can plant buffer zones along waterways, so that's going to help prevent flooding from storm surges, and it also helps reduce, pollutant runoff and erosion. You can vote to support environmental regulations, and just like we talked about those super rainy days, you can give frogs and toads a break and just try to drive a little bit slower to avoid our amphibian friends. Thank you, guys. Everyone.
Nice.
I'm so happy that I got to come here and, I got to stay here and virtually come to you, but it's been an honor. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'm happy to stay for a couple questions if you are.
I have a few more. Thank you, guys. I just want to thank everybody really quickly again for joining us today. We love having everybody for Lunch Break Science. So we hope to see you back next time as well. Gosh, I can't believe it's June already, but next week's is hold on, I'll spit it out in a second. Next week's on tidal tidings, astronomical causes of the Earth's tides and beyond. So if you like tides, join us for that. We have one question that's come up a couple of times. I think there's a gentleman that would like to know if frogs can stand on two legs.
Interesting. Some do puff themselves up quite a bit to try to make themselves look bigger. Like I think of a snake. Snakes can only eat things that's so much bigger than the size of their head, like 3 times. So they might try to like puff themselves up to be like, nope, look at me, I'm so big, you can't eat me. And I think that might make it look like they're standing on their hind legs, but I have not witnessed such a thing.
It's an interesting question, yeah. Another question was, how many different types of amphibians have been recorded at Maymont?
At Maymont, okay. So it's seasonal, so not all of our frogs and toads are most active or calling at the same time during the year. So throughout the year, we hear typically about 8 or 9 species using Maymont's property as breeding grounds. I think I have heard some not necessarily at our monitoring site. So I'm going to go on a limb and say that there are probably about 10 species that are regularly inhabiting Maymont's property throughout the year.
Cool. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody again for coming, and a huge thank you to April. April, you've got a lot of nice thank yous in the chat.
Awesome.
And again, for those of you joining us, join us next week, same time, Wednesday at noon.